and welcome to the Guitarist Guru series. We'll be looking at the basics today, so understanding the basics of your guitar, the names of the certain areas of the guitar, and also just the basics of the strings and the string names as well. So let's get going. So first of all, your guitar. Okay, now different types of guitar. This is an electric guitar, but obviously we have an acoustic guitar, which is either a steel string, predominantly a steel strung guitar, or a classical guitar, which is a nylon strung guitar. Now, I get asked a lot, obviously as a teacher, what's the best guitar to start off with? Difficult to tell. Price is obviously an issue. Nowadays you can pick up a guitar for next to nothing, but the problem with that is sometimes if you buy cheaper end guitars, they're not that easy to play. So I always say, go for what you can afford. If you can afford a couple of £100 on a guitar, go for that. But also, go into a shop and try them. It's very easy to buy online now, but I'd always recommend maybe trying them out first. It doesn't matter if you've never played guitar before, just go into a shop and ask them just to kind of, can I just sit down with the guitar? Can I just feel it and see how it fits with you? They all have different weights, different sizes, and playing a musical instrument, is definitely a personal choice, and I always recommend trying it out first and spending a little bit of time just getting used to it. But when you do, and when you've kind of got your weapon of choice, then you need to understand how it works and what it does. So this is just a quick overview of, we're going to look at electric guitar here first of all, but we name different parts of the guitar. So this area here, fairly straightforward really, is the body. If I hold it up like that, you can kind of get more of a feel of how this works. But this is your body, this is your neck, and this is your headstock, or call it the head. Really, that's there's different ways and different terms on that side of things. So that's your main component of your guitar. Looking at the front of here, the front of your neck is what we call the fretboard. Okay, and this is our kind of workspace. This is our work area. The fretboard is very much like a keyboard or a piano, and obviously without the black and white notes. But it does the same thing, and we'll get into a bit more detail about those a little bit later. So on our fretboard here, we have these metal bits here, which are called frets. Now, we have two types of frets here. We have the frets that we avoid, i.e. the metal parts here, and we have the frets that we put our fingers on, or technically the fret. Right? So these are our metal parts here, which are what we call the frets. But the gaps, the areas where we actually work and we put our fingers in, are called, I call them a fret. So when you put our fingers on the fret. All right? Okay. So that's our kind of workspace here. This little white section here is called the nut of the guitar. That becomes a little bit more important the more we get into our chord playing, and to understand how we kind of use that in relation to our chords, and how we move our chords up and down the guitar. But we'll get into that in a little bit of a later stage. So we have our nut here, so we've got our frets, and we have our fret in the gap here. These marker dots, these little dots here, well, these are quite important because that shows us exactly where we are on the guitar. Musically, it doesn't have any reference, i.e. it doesn't indicate a specific note, but what it does do, it just gives us a bit of a grounding, especially when because of your sighting here, when you're looking at the guitar, especially if you're standing up, you're kind of looking above, so your reference is sometimes, unless you know your notes really well, it's knowing exactly, okay, well that's the 3rd fret, that's the 5th fret, 7th, 9th and 12th, okay? But also on here, on some guitars they do, but you'll have dots above here as well on the corresponding frets. So we actually number our frets as well as we play. Now we'll get into kind of understanding how to play it and using the correct fingering for that. But a quick reference is, when you play a string, not worried about the name of the string at the moment, but if I just play the string here on its own, it's what we call playing the open string. Okay, i.e. I'm right-handed, we're not using my left hand at all. Our fretting hand is what we call it. So it's open string. Okay? If I go up to the first fret, it's called the first fret. Second fret, third fret, fourth fret, and so on. Okay? Right. Not worried about the notes I'm playing at the moment, we'll get on to that. But it's important to know the notes of each open string. So, on a piano, I use piano quite a lot to indicate kind of musical octaves and the musical scales, but if we start very low on the left hand side of a piano, we're playing the low notes, the bass notes. If we go to the right hand side, we're playing the high notes. On a guitar, we go from low, i.e. the top of the guitar here, to high, which is at the bottom of the guitar. So, for example, this note here is called our low E. Okay? When I'm playing it like that, it's just called the open E. Okay? Next string down, or technically up, it can get slightly confusing because our low E is classed as the sixth string on our guitar. The next string down, our guitar, is the A, and that's the fifth string. Next one is the D, and that's the fourth. Go down one more, we go to the G, third. Down again to a B, and that's a second, and then we get to the high E. So we have two E strings on the guitar. We have a high E and a low E. Now the high E is number one. Okay, so it technically goes from bottom to top in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. E, B, G, D, A, and E. That makes sense, but you'll get used to those, and it's good to kind of learn those because they are your staple parts of the guitar. It gets much more advanced if you really wanted it to, but everything starts, if you're learning guitar, with those basic open strings. Okay. Now, I'm going to look at the fretting hand a second here. Now, when we're playing, we obviously want to make some different sounds. So we could just play the open strings like that, which is great, that's fine. But actually you can't do much with that unless you're combining it with some other notes. Now, musically, when we play an open E string, for example, I'll do it like that. Okay, that's great, that gives me an E. But in music, we need to understand maybe what the series of notes, and this will come later. But just so we want to get some variety of sounds, some different pitches of notes, we need to play some frets. So the way we do that is by using our fretting hand, our left hand, if you're a right-handed guitarist, and vice versa, if you're a left-handed guitarist. Now, I'm going to number my fingers to make it easy, and the way I teach is try and keep things as simple as possible. So the way I look at it is 1, 2, 3, 4. 5 is your thumb. If you want to get a bit of flash with that, that happens a bit later, you can use your thumb, but technically we're just going to use 1, 2, 3 and 4. But we're going to start off with our first finger, and all I'm going to do is I'm going to just put my hand, and all I'm going to do is lay my thumb, just sit it on top of the guitar here, so it kind of hooks it over, and you get kind of a little arch around here. You can see how that's kind of moving around. Right, so I'm using my thumb as a bit of a pivot, or it's also a stability factor on there, just kind of wave it around there. Now, when I do this, I'm going to just use my first finger here. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to put my first finger now on our open E string, which is our 6th string, okay? But I'm going to put it on fret number 1. Let's say we number this by the area, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. So, if I put my first finger on that string, now, this is an electric guitar, so it's actually a little bit easier to press into the strings. The strings are a little bit lighter than maybe an acoustic strung guitar, a steel strung guitar. But that becomes something you get used to. So it's just getting used to your fingers pressing into bits of wire, basically. They will get a little bit sore, and the best way to approach this is by little and often. Okay, you will get sore fingers. That's without question of a doubt. You just got to ride it, and it will dissipate as the more you play. But initially, little and often. 5 minutes on, doing your little techniques as we learn this. Take a bit of time off and come back to it. Great way of learning as well is just bite-size playing. Okay, so I'm going to roll my thumb, get my thumbs nice and comfortable on there, just at the back of the guitar. You can do it that way as well. You can have a bit low here. You don't want to go too low, because otherwise you're not going to feel comfortable. But just the rest of the area here is pretty good. First finger, all I'm going to do is I'm going to imagine my fingers are on tiptoes now. So I'm going to play it like this, and my finger is actually on a tiptoe. So I'm going to press it in to that fret here. So fret number 1 on the low E string. Push it in. We've just played an F note. Now, if I take my finger off and play the open string, and then put it back on again, you can hear now we're starting to obviously create different pitches of sound. Now, finger-wise, I always say that imagine your fingers are on tiptoes. Okay, so if you're tiptoeing with your fingers, that's the way you press into the strings. If you go too flat, i.e. just go like that and you kind of push your fingers down like that, you'll find you're not getting much push or much bite onto that string. That string has to go down and touch, ideally touch the wood part of the fret underneath. Okay. Now if I move up to fret number 2 and do the same thing again, obviously you can hear the notes are starting to change. And all you need to do is just walk up the guitar, just get used to it as well. So once you've done that, I don't know if you've noticed, but my finger tends to stay within a certain area of each fret. Now there's a sweet spot for your frets. If I was to put my finger here, for example, on this part of the fret, if I go a bit closer you can see where I'm talking. See it on here, if I put my finger there at that part of the fret, you get a lot of buzzing. It's not an ideal position. So what you tend to do to get a better sound is imagine you're pushing your finger up 2/3 up that fret. Okay? Same there. There's a sweeter spot, sweeter sound. Okay? If I move it back there, it doesn't work. It doesn't work as well anyway. And so actually, you don't actually have to put a lot of pressure onto those fingers to produce that sound. I'm not pressing very hard here, and that's something you get used to. Just need to be confident with it. Just push down a bit of confidence, it doesn't have to press too hard. Difficult to explain, easier to practice in your own time to do that. Alright? So, get used to doing that. Once you're happy with that, why don't you try your second finger? So, doing the same thing again, just walking up the guitar like that, third finger, and the like. And by doing that, what you're doing, and you'll notice there my fingers have got little lines on, you'll have fingers that, your fingers will get lines on, don't worry about it. You'll get through all that, it's fine. You just need to keep persevering with it. So, just a slight recap, so you've looked at your open strings. So we've looked at the names of our open strings. We've got A, we've got, that's rubbish. We've got E, we've got A, we've got D, we've got G, we've got B, and we've got the high E. Okay, we've got our frets here as we go on. Now, just one final point on this session. We've got these dots, these marker dots, okay, so we've got them at the 3rd fret, the 5th, the 7th, the 9th and the 12th. Right, when you get to the 12th fret, most guitars will have 2 dots, and what this signifies is that we've played what we call the whole scale, the 12 note scale. In music there are 12 notes, and those 12 notes just repeat themselves and repeat themselves, okay? So if I, for example, play the open E string here, and then then I go up to my 12th fret and play the 12th fret. I'm also playing an E. So we've actually gone all the way through our musical scale from E to E. Okay, and that's the same on each string. So A string, A, D, D, G. Okay. I hope that helps. I hope that gives you a basic view. One more thing, just before I forget this one. These little bits here, these are called your machine heads or your tuning keys. This is for tuning your guitar. First and foremost, the most fundamental part of your guitar playing is making sure your guitar's in tune. If you have any problems with that, pop back into the shop or wherever you purchased your guitar and just have a word with them and say about getting a guitar tuner. Very simple thing. You can get a little tuner that clips onto the end of your guitar, and all you do is you play the string and it will tell you if your guitar string is in tune. If it's not, then you tighten these or loosen these depending on if you're below the note that you need to get to or above the note. But we'll do a bit more work on that in future sessions. I hope that helps, and I'll see you on the next session. Hi and welcome back to the Guitarist Guru series, and for this session we are going to be looking at picks or plectrums. Right, so obviously we want to make sure our left hand is doing what it needs to do with regards to kind of finding the notes and fretting the notes, but the right hand is also hugely important, if not more so, because without this hand we're not going to get much out of this hand. So I tend to use, when I'm playing my electric guitar anyway, a pick or a plectrum, and people can hold it in different ways to kind of get this to sit comfortably with themselves, but I'm going to show you the way I play it, or the way I use a plectrum, and the way I kind of hold it as well. Let's have a quick closer look at this. Right, so I've got two types of guitar pick here. And the first one is a little bit bigger than the one I normally use. As you can see there, that's one size here, and actually this is the pick that I use. It's a little bit smaller. Now the reason I use a pick that's a little bit smaller is that I find that getting closer to the strings, for me, works better. I sometimes find that having a bigger pick, especially on an electric guitar, doesn't really help me. It kind of gets in the way. But I do find that I tend to use a bigger pick when I'm playing an acoustic guitar. So it is a personal choice. And picks or plectrums come in all shapes and sizes, different colours, different grips, and different thicknesses as well. The one I've got here is of medium thickness. All right. The one I've got here, the small one, is really rigid. It's quite heavy. Okay, and you can't bend it as easy as you can this one. All right, but I would recommend, if you're starting out at this is all new to you, I'd use something that's quite thin, because it'll make your life probably a little bit easier, and it's more forgiving when you play. All right, okay, so I'm going to demonstrate with this pick because you can see this a little bit better. Right, so how do we do it? How do we hold it? Now, first of all, different players have different grips for picks. Now, I'll show you how I use mine and how I put it together. So, I take my right hand, because this is my strumming hand. I put my thumb up like that, and what I do here is I put the plectrum just to the face of my thumb at right angles, so i.e. the same direction as the neck of my guitar. Right, so I put it like that, so you can see it's nice and flat against that thumb. Right, with my first finger here, I use this as a trigger. So if I'm pulling a trigger on a gun or whatever you need to pull your trigger on for, is you put it like that, and you see the first this part of my finger rolls over and kind of clamps to that pick. Now, that's kind of where we are with it at the moment, right? So if I turn it that way, then what you'll find is the pick is protruding here, and your first finger and your thumb are flat, right? So you can kind of run your fingers over like that. Now what that's giving me the opportunity to do, if I turn that way, and I've imagined that my finger now is the string, the thumb and my first finger aren't getting in the way of the strings. Sometimes if I go flat like that, and my first finger's up like that, if I now go and play the string, it gets in the way, all right? So you need to kind of keep it nice and tucked up. Now the thing is as well, you also want to free up these fingers a bit more, because when you're really gripping like that, it doesn't really work. All the pick is, it acts as an extension of your fingers onto the strings, and just enables you to kind of strum the strings a little bit easier, all right? So what I tend to say, right, start again, put your thumb there, bang, just kind of grip it so it feels comfortable. There's a little hole here, that helps as well. Just kind of let that hand kind of throw out like that. But technically that is how I tend to grip my pick. What I'll also do is maybe, because I'm using the bigger pick here, okay, so there's a lot more surface area that's on show here. I might just tuck that in a little bit more, just tuck it up. So I'm losing some of the surface area. The idea is that the closer I can get my hand to the strings, okay, the more control I have when I'm playing. So, when you're strumming with your guitar, with your right hand here, what you'll tend to find is you've got to really relax it. If it's really rigid, you get that horrible, horrible sound. But if you're nice and relaxed and let that hand kind of float around a little bit, kind of brushing, it's like brush strokes. Just imagine you're painting up and down the guitar. Now, actually, I'm not gripping that plectrum very hard at all, really. It's literally just kind of sitting in my fingers and it's comfortable. All right? So that's how I grip my plectrum. You want to kind of trial it out and go for what you feel comfortable. But I hope that helps, and I hope that helps towards kind of getting you comfortable with your right hand technique, as well as what, you know, we're looking at your left hand as well. Good stuff, and I'll see you next time. Hi, and welcome to the Guitarist Guru series. And on this session, we'll be looking at some open chords. Now, open chords, or chords in general, are a real staple diet of learning your guitar. Being able to play with other people, being able to kind of pick up songs very quickly, hopefully, and being able to play thousands of songs in a short space of time. So, we'll be looking at these four chords today. So, it's the G major chord, the D major, the E minor, and the C chord. Okay, now these chords here, once you've learnt them, and just in that sequence alone, so G, D, E minor and C, you can play some recognisable songs straight away. Just an example, here are a few, just to give you an idea. Don't stop believing, hold on to this feeling. So it's Journey. Apologise for the voice, it's quite early in the morning. So lately, wondering, with a head to take your place. It's the Calling, Wherever We Will Go. Or you're going to get a bit more rocky. Since you've been gone, since you've been gone, I'm out of my head, can't take it. Okay, or if you just want to do something like U2, with or without you, with or without you. Just four chords. Now, I'm not putting too much effort into the rhythm side, but we will talk about rhythm on that one as well. But you can see how, just in a very short space of time, hopefully you'll be able to play a couple of tunes that you'll recognise, and you'll get a bit benefit out of just strumming, picking your guitar up and just strumming it as well, just having a play. So let's have a look in a little bit more detail. We're going to do close-ups on this as well, just to make life a little bit easier. Right, let's start with your first chord here, which is your G major. So I'm going to be using 3 fingers here. So 1, 2 and 3 here. My first finger is going to go on the 2nd fret of my A string. So remember what I said in the first session, our first guru session, about finger placements? Try and get your fingers 2/3 up the fret if you can, in that sequence there. Alright, so that's your first finger there. Your second finger, you're going to just pop onto the 3rd fret of the E string. Okay, so you put those together, you just pick them individually. Now with this hand here, all I'm doing is using a pick. Now you can use your fingers if you like, but we will talk about pick techniques and pick action as we go on through our sessions. But I'm not really fussed about how you do it today. It's just getting a sound. So if you want to use your thumb just to go down the strings like that, great, that's not a problem. If you want to use your hands, strum it using your nails, using your fingers, or if you want to use a pick, any way, shape you want to do that. We'll worry about that at a later date. Okay, so back to this hand here. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4. And all I'm going to do, first of all, is just kind of play down. Now we're going to start off with 2 fingers, but I will be using our 3rd finger as well. But just to making sure that these 2 fingers here are independent of each other. Now what I mean by that is, if you put your first finger, as you say, you've got it on here on the 2nd fret of the A, you want to make sure that it's not touching the string underneath. Now what I mean by that is, if it is, okay, it means it's kind of touching the D string. You want to try and avoid that and try and really get it on those tiptoes. Remember I mentioned about the tiptoes before. Arch your fingers right over so you can get a nice clean sound here. It's going to take a bit of practice, so I don't expect you to be able to pick this up overnight if you've never done this before, but just persevere with it. Remember your thumb. If your thumb is too high, actually your hand gets dragged down, right? Which means that you're going to get caught on some of those strings as well. You don't want that. So just bring your hand down underneath. Shake your hand off. You might feel that you're getting a little bit tense with it. It happens. Your shoulders get a little bit tense as well. So you just want to just relax on it, shake your hand off, and then bring it back to the position again. So let's carry on with the chords. So we've got first finger on the 2nd fret of the A string. 2nd finger on the 3rd fret of the E, the low E string. And now our 3rd finger is going to really drop right down to the bottom here, and that's going to go on to the high E string at the 3rd fret. Okay, so put that down there. So what we've got here, if I strum them all together, is our G chord, all being well. Remember what I said about the fretting sound? If your hand's too flat, your fingers might be getting caught on the underside of these strings here. So really trying to arch them up. The G chord is probably the hardest chord here because it's a bit of a stretch. Alright. Okay. D chord. So let's go to D chord. So the way I tend to look at chords is I like to visualise them as shapes. So when I play a D chord, the way this works is my first finger goes on, now it's on the G string here, okay? And it's at the 2nd fret, and you'll see what I mean about shape in a second here. But that's my second fret with my first finger. My 2nd finger will go on the high E string at the 2nd fret again. So this time we've got 2 fingers on there. Okay, try and push them up as far as you can in the frets without going too far into the 3rd fret, for example. You try and keep it there. And then the 3rd finger is going to go in between the 2 on the 3rd fret of the B string. So if you were to do a dot to dot on these fingers, I would say it's like a triangle turned on its side. And you'll see the chord shapes come up in a minute, and you'll see what I mean by that, by the chords that come up on the screen, just to help you here. Alright, so that is your D chord. Now when you play this D chord, you don't actually strum all of the strings. You strum everything from the D string, so from these 4 strings here, okay? So you just strum it. Now the reason we call these open strings, just for your reference, is that every chord that we're playing here has our an open string in it, i.e. a string that hasn't got our finger sitting on it. All right, so if you look at the D chord, obviously we've got 3 fingers here, but our D string is the one that's open. All right. Okay, moving on, we have our E minor. Now, we've played 2 major chords, major happy's major basically, minor, a little bit sadder. So this is probably the easiest chord to pick up because it's only 2 fingers as well. So your first finger now will go onto the 2nd fret of your A string, all right? And then your 2nd finger will go underneath it onto the D string, again at the 2nd fret. Now this one, you're actually just strumming all of the strings. Very kind of deepy, moody chord, that one. And that is called the E minor. Again, try and get those fingers on tiptoes. If they're too flat, they'll catch underneath. Okay. Right. And then the last chord in our sequence is the C chords, the C major. Right, so first and foremost, before we do anything else, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just take my first finger off. Okay, my first finger off. Because where my 2nd finger is now, which is on the D string at the 2nd fret, that's actually part of our C chord. Right? So I'm going to keep that there as a bit of a pivot note just to help out. So this first finger is going to start now on the 1st fret of the B string. So it's that one there. Okay. Then we need our 3rd finger again. Bit more of a stretch this one because we're covering 3 frets. So our 3rd finger will then go up to our 3rd fret on our A string. All right. So it's kind of like it's like a, I don't know why I say this, but it's like an escalator. If you dot to dot, it's a little arch over that little sequence. So that's the shape that I'm seeing on here. Okay. Again, this is slightly tricky because you've got to get your fingers on tiptoes. You'll find that this first finger might catch that high E string. So you just need to make sure you get it nice and clear if you can. To be honest, you're going to get a little bit of fret buzz, and that fret buzz is that sound. Don't worry, it's all part of learning the guitar, but the more you understand what you're doing to make that sound, the more likelihood you'll be able to kind of sort it out as you go on and get used to it. And because your fingers might be a little bit soft at the moment, they will harden up. And because they're soft, the area that you're pressing down is actually greater, I suppose. When your fingers get harder, it's easier to pinpoint those fingers on the frets as well. So that's your C chord. Now, if I go back to the beginning, and what I'm going to do here is I'm going to kind of piece them together in a nice slow way, and you can see what I mean by certain chords fit nicely together, and it makes life a little bit easier. One of the quickest ways to kind of learn your chord changes is by sometimes keeping fingers on the guitar as you change. Now that works in the case of playing E minor into the C chord, because I'm using that finger, my 2nd finger, as a pivot finger. Okay, which is great. So if you've got those 2 chords together, it works quite nicely. Obviously it doesn't always work with every chord because they don't always join as a large dot to dot. Okay. But let's just try and put them together. So we got our G chord, which is the first one up here. Now, when I'm going to play it in this sequence, I'm going to go from G to D to E minor to C. Right? So by doing this, I'm going to keep some fingers till last, till I move. So for example, I'm going to go from G, right, and then going to take the fingers off, but I'm going to keep my third finger just grounded on the guitar, just as a balance, until I get my fingers into my D chord, okay? And then I'm going to move that finger. By doing that, I use it as a bit of a pivot chord, okay? Right? So that'll take a little bit of practice, but do it nice and slow. We'll get onto that in a second. And then the next is the E minor. So if I, from D to my E minor, what I'm just going to keep now that third finger on the guitar just until I've got those two fingers on the E minor chord, and then I'm going to take it off. Okay. Right, and then the final chord is the C. I'm going to keep that finger on the guitar as I change. And that gives me a little pivot note there. So from the E minor, I find that just makes life just a little bit easier by doing that. Alright? Okay. So you put them together. So as a good practice, I always recommend sticking to a time. So you have your own timing. When music is normally done to time, unless you're playing really obscure jazz or fusion or something that's just a bit avant-garde. But what I mean by that is if I count 1, 2, 3, 4. There's 4 beats in a musical bar for this. So I'm going to play it something like this. I'm going to start with my G chord. I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, 4. Then I'm going to change to the D. 2, 3, 4. Into the E minor. 2, 3, 4. 2, 3, 4. Now obviously I'm quite used to changing my chords, so the time that it takes me to change from one chord to another is very quick. But I've also been a beginner, and I've also known the struggle of changing the chords and getting your fingers into those positions. Now the thing is, it's what we call muscle memory. Your fingers will suddenly get used to it. The more you play, obviously, the more you get used to something, your fingers become more familiar. It's the same with this as well. So you need to push your left hand, your fretting hand, to move a little bit quicker automatically. So I want you to then keep the beat. So whatever you do, and this is where musicians, when they practice, a lot of musicians will use a metronome or a drum beat, something that just keeps the time constant in the background so they're aware of the musical changes, the timing changes. So you can do this with yourself, and you know, you can go online, you can get a kind of a free metronome. All it is just a click track. It's just that kind of constant click track. But by just using that as a practice aid, it will help you push your playing a little bit quicker and get your fingers and your muscle memory in your fingers to work a little bit better as well. So what do I mean by this? Right, I'm gonna, that's my phone, it's typical, isn't it? I'm gonna do this. So what I'm gonna do here is I'm gonna play the G for 1, 2, 3, 4. Now the time that it changes, the time it takes me to change between those chords, I've got 3 beats technically. So it's going to go like this. It's going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So what that's actually then doing is giving me a little bit of breathing space to get those chords to get the chords, well, get the fingers into the right chord position. Now what you do, once you've practiced that a couple of times, you notice you've got 3 beats, and you know, timing wise depends on how fast you want to do it, but make sure that you get your fingers as much as you possibly can ready for the next bar, so the bar of music. So every time you get back to 1, you should be on that chord ready to play. All right. And then once you've done that, you can practice it and just get the speed up. So this time then you can go, right, well, I'm going to play G, but I'm going to play it for 2, I'm going to strum it for 2 beats. And then I'm going to have a 2-beat rest, i.e. the time it takes me to change, give me a little bit of time to change those chords. So for example, it goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 1, 2, 3, 4. And just get used to kind of going around in that circuit there. I would just say, just keep practicing with that. Chords, once you get your head around the chords and once you get your fingers moving in the positions, your life becomes much more enjoyable as a guitarist because you can start getting some recognisable sounds in your guitar players. Just getting used to going through the chords, just working, even doing without strumming sometimes. Just going to sit there and maybe if you're sitting watching TV, you know, you don't have to have your guitar plugged in if you've got an electric guitar or whatever. Just sit there and just get your fingers used to it. You know, it's all good practice. It's all good practice. Good. Anyway, I hope that helps, and I will see you on our next session. Enjoy. Hello and welcome again to the Guitarist Guru series. On this session we are continuing from our open chord session that we had before when we looked at G major, E minor, C major and D major. So we're just going to have a look at a few more open chords now that you can add into your playing mix as well. So hopefully by now you'll get into grips with those 4 chords. So let's start having a look at some of the others that we're going to look at today. So first one's going to be the E major. Alright. Next one's going to be the A major. And then we're going to start looking at a couple of minor chords as well. So we looked at the E minor one before. This time we're going to look at the A minor. And then we're going to look at the D minor. Okay. Great. So let's have a look at these in a bit of a closer detail. Okay, so first up we're going to look at the E major chord. Now for this we're going to be using 3 fingers here, and along the bottom of the screen here you'll see the chord diagrams pop up as well. So they'll be able to help you hopefully along the way. Any other information you can find on my website at www.jefftop.com and where you can download some of the images as well, so the chord charts as well as the fretboard notes as well. Alright, so how do we play an E major? Well, it goes like this. First finger goes on the G string at the 1st fret. Your second finger goes on the 2nd fret of the A string, and then your third one goes underneath that, so it's on the D string at the 3rd fret on the D string as well. Right. So all you need to do, remember, try and keep your fingers up 2/3 up the frets, as I said before, to get a much better sound. So what you do here, you just literally strum all of the strings. There you go. Okay, so that's your E major chord. Next one is our A chord, is A major. Now this one's a little trickier because we've got to do everything within the 2nd fret now, and they're using 3 fingers again, but this time we're using our 1st finger on the 2nd fret of the D string, our 2nd finger on the where we're going, the G at the 2nd fret, and then our 3rd finger on the B string at the 2nd fret. So it's a bit of a tight squeeze, you've really got to tuck them in. Now this is a good opportunity to get those fingers on tiptoes. If they're not on tiptoes, that makes that chord much harder to play. So try to tuck them in. If that 3rd finger is touching the high E string, you just need to really kind of arch it over. Really get them in a little kind of bunch together, really bunch them together there, that's where you can. So with this, we don't strum all the strings here, we strum from the 5th string, the A string. The reason we do that, very much like when we played the E chord, we start with the E string. Okay? With the A chord, we start with the A string. So we strum them together. Okay? So So that's your A major chord. So, there are your two majors from this little series. Let's look at the minors now. So we're going to look at an A minor chord. Right, so first finger for this one goes on the first fret of your B string. The second finger goes on the D string at the second fret. And then the third one tucks underneath that and goes onto the G at the second fret. Now the shape of this is exactly the same shape as we play an E major. So that's our E major chord. All we do is move them all down one set of strings. This time we start from the A string because we're playing an A minor chord, and it goes like this. Okay, right. Now a good little exercise to do is take your E major chord and just go between the two chords. Good little exercise just to kind of get your fingers used to A moving and also to keeping the actual shapes that you need as well. All right. So that's your A minor chord, and then the last one we're going to look at on this one on the series here is the D minor. Now a little bit more of a stretch this one because we're covering 3 frets, and so finger placement is quite important. So my first finger goes on the high E string at the first fret. Your second finger goes on the second fret of the G, and then your third one goes along to the third fret on the B string. Now, like with the other chords, we start from the root note of that chord. So if we're starting, so this is a D minor, which means we start from the D string, okay, and here. So we're starting from this string here. We're not playing the low 2 strings at all. So we strum 4 strings. Okay, and that is your D minor. So, remember what I said before about your chord changes and trying to keep them as easy as possible. So you can use a rhythm pattern before, like we did before with the other chords. I.e. counting up to 4 beats in a bar, so you could start with one strum maybe on an E chord, 2, 3, 4, then maybe trying the A chord, 2, 3, 4, A minor, 3, 4, D minor, 3, 4, okay? So there are ways of kind of getting through the chords. Now obviously that in itself is just a 4 chord sequence. But if you start introducing the other chords that you looked at before, you've suddenly got, now you've got 8 different types of open chord that you can play. Get used to just playing through them all. So let me just show you what I mean by that. So I'm going to start with a G chord. So we'll start with our open G chord that we used before. So we're going to go 1, 2, 3, down to the D, 2, 3. I'm going to go to A minor this time. 2, 3, into the C. 2, 3, 4. D minor. 2, 3, 4. E minor. 2, 3, 4. A. 2, 3, 4. And then E. 2, 3, 4. Okay, so you've got your 8 open chords there that are quite nice to kind of get used to playing. Now if you learn those chords, as I explained before with just using the G, D, E minor and C, how many songs you can actually play just by using 4 chords. Now you've got 8, you're going to take it even further. So that is something that we'll start to develop as we go along. But remember what I said before, so try and keep the timing constant, so always use a timing element to your chord playing. Make sure that you're pushing yourself to try and change the chords on time. All right. Just keep those fingers and just get familiar with shapes as well. You know, visualize them as specific shapes to you. The way I learned my chords was I just looked at the shape, so I could tell that's an E shape. It's kind of like if you put dot to dot, it's an L shape on its side. That's the way I look at it anyway. You can look at it in your own way as well. As I said about the C chord, it has a little arch. The D chord, it's like a triangle turned on its side. All right, so it's just ways of remembering it what makes it easy for yourself as well. All right, so on the next chord series, we are going to be looking at what we call the seventh chords, or the dominant chords, as they're technically known. So get to grips with these, and we'll come back and have a look at some of the more bluesier dominant chords on the next session. Hi and welcome back to the Guitarist Guru series, and we'll be looking at today a continuation of your chord playing and your open chords, but this time we're going to be looking at what we call the dominant chords, the seventh chords. Now these chords are, if you like your blues, then these are the chords for you, and you'll find a lot of blues music would have used, or still does, use what we call the seventh of a dominant chord. Now why it's called a dominant, that gets into the more kind of technical elements that we'll move into in the later stage. But these chords themselves, actually, from a playability point of view, probably are slightly easier than some of the other open chords that we've looked at already, because actually they use less fingers. Not all of them, but a couple do. So the sound, what we're going to be looking at today is we'll be looking at the E7 chord. A7, the D7, the B7. Now the B7, I warn you now, is probably your hardest chord to learn today because it involves all four fingers. Okay. And the C7, again, this involves four fingers, but we've already played the C, so hopefully that should help you a little bit on that one. And then a G7. Okay. Now, just to give you an example of how these chords work together, I'm just going to play a little chord sequence, and one thing that will become a bit more familiar with yourselves, if you're not familiar already, is what we call the 12 bar blues, or a 3 chord trick, or another way they call it the 1, 4 and 5. Again, that comes more technical. We'll move into that at a later stage. Okay, so this is your 12 bar blues chord sequence using those seventh chords, just using E7, A7 and B7. Here we go. 1, 2, 3, 4, down to the A7, 2 bars, 2, back to the E7, 9, B7, A7, E7, last bar, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so that is a standard 12 bar blues chord sequence. And a lot of blues music just repeats that chord sequence over and over again. Now obviously that's a little bit staged at the moment, it's just kind of a single strum pattern, but obviously the more you get used to the chord changes, the more you can get used to your right hand rhythms as well. And again, we'll look at that further on through the course. So let's have a look at these chords in a little bit more detail. Right then, so let's start off with our E7 chord. E7 chord is very much like our E major chord, where we had our first finger on the first fret of the G, my second finger on the A string at the second fret. Now, when we played an E major chord, we just add that third finger down underneath. We don't need that for the E7, it's literally just the two fingers. Alright? and that is your E7, E dominant 7 chord. Okay. Next one we're going to look at is the A7. So remember beforehand we had, when we played an A major, we went 1, 2 and 3, i.e. the first finger was on the D string at the 2nd fret, and then followed down underneath. So for this one, first finger stays again on the 2nd fret of the D string, but then my third finger, I tend to use my third finger instead of my second, because that to me feels more comfortable than when I play an A chord, I'm using 3 fingers. When I don't need that finger, I'm just going to take that one off, and that produces the A7. So literally it is the first finger there on the 2nd fret of the D, and then the third finger is on the 2nd fret of the B. And then all you do is you strum, again, like the A chord, you strum from the A string. Okay, you could hear there was a slightly muted note there because I had my finger caught underneath there. So you just need to make sure you've got a bit of clearance from there. We're all human, and it all takes a bit of practice as well. So even us professionals sometimes get a little bit caught and we don't think about what we're doing. So let's moving on. So we've got E7, you've got A7. The next chord is the D7. Now when we played a D major chord, remember it was like the triangle turned on its side pointing this way. Well, this is the opposite to that, because our first finger goes on the B string at the 1st fret, second finger goes on the G at the 2nd fret, and then the third one goes on the high E at the 2nd fret. So if you notice now, the triangle is now pointing the other way. That's the dot to dot shape, if you remember I talked about that before. And from here you play just from the D string again, because that is our root note, and that's the sound that you get. Alright? Okay. So you've got E7, A7 and D7. Now comes the fun one. The one that you'll probably be cursing for a while until you get your fingers comfortable with this one. This is the B7. Now, if I put my first finger on the 1st fret of my D string, because that's where we start, okay, my second finger goes on the 2nd fret of the A string. Now, this note here is actually quite important because this is the root note, i.e. that note there on the 2nd fret is the B. Okay, so that is my root note. So that's where we start our strumming pattern from. We don't play the bass E string on this one either. Right? So those 2 fingers are there. Then the third finger is on the G at the 2nd fret. And then our little pinky comes into play here. So we're going to go right onto the high E at the 2nd fret, right underneath there. Now, this one's tricky because you need to make sure that little finger and that third finger isn't touching that open B string. To be honest, you might find it is at the moment, and if you get a bit of connection with your finger to that string, you might get that sound. Do you know what? I really wouldn't worry too much about this, because this is something that once your fingers have got a little bit harder and they've toughened up a little, and you'll find in your fingers and your technique becomes much better, it will naturally, your hand will naturally arch over and your fingers will go on tiptoes and avoid that B string. But you just got to persevere with it as well. You notice my thumb's quite high on here as well. It's just comfortable for me to do that. Right, a lot of people say about the thumb, and the thumb's really important, it must be in a certain place behind the guitar. To be honest, the rule book goes out the window. You have to at least try and get your fingers to a point where they feel comfortable and they can play the strings without sounding too fret buzzy. All right, so you just go where you feel comfortable. You'll find if your thumb's not there and your thumb's here, that's not comfortable. All right, that shouldn't be there. So it's got to be somewhere around here just to feel comfortable. Right, so you play those three, the B7 together. So starting from the A string. Okay. If you want to just make sure, do you want to check your strings, just pick through the strings just to see if they're all clear of each other. Alright, so that's your B7. Okay, and then the next chord is a C7. So we've obviously played the C in the past. this time we add the little finger on to the 3rd fret of our G string. So, and that adds that kind of bluesier sound to the chord. So the normal C and C7. And then our final dominant chord for this session is the G7. Now this one's a stretchy one. You've got to cover from high string to low string over 3 frets. All right. So first finger goes on the high E at the 1st fret. Second finger goes onto the 2nd fret of my A string. And then my 3rd finger goes on the 3rd fret of my low E. Now, there is a bit of a stretch going on here. So the idea is you're really going to get those strings. You may find, now if you notice my thumb now is right back here. Okay. Now for me, it has to be, because my fingers won't stretch that far unless my thumb's this low. If I'm up here, you can hear those strings are pulling and they're touching each other. So you just need to... Alright. Okay, so as before, you can put those chords together. Maybe have a look at what I mentioned about the 12-bar blues sequence as well. We will have a whole session on 12-bar blues and how it kind of goes together on a later session. But again, you have another 6 chords to add to your chord armoury now. And these are all classed as open chords, except these ones will be shown with a little 7 by the side of it. And that, every time you see a chord that's got a 7 by the side of it, just on its own, means it's called a dominant chord, and is used quite a lot in blues guitar playing as well. Alright, so enjoy and good luck with that, and I'll be back with some more chords at a later date. Hello again, and welcome to the Guitarist Guru series. Today we'll be looking at some very basic guitar scales that you can use when you kind of play along with anything. Maybe you're listening to on a backing track or playing with something else. But it's also good to kind of get your fingers around some of the basic scales. Now we're not going to talk heavy theory, so don't worry about that. So if theory is not your thing, seriously, it's not a problem. We can play guitar, to be quite honest, without learning a lot of theory to start off with. And the idea here is just to give you some ideas and how you can pick up some very basic guitar riffs, some really cool ones actually, that you can use now, and you can, give them an hour, a bit of practice, and hopefully you can get some sounds coming back out of your guitar. So first and foremost, scales. Scales are very important as a tool for your guitar playing. There are so many different scales in the grand scheme of things, not just in guitaring, but generally scales rule the roost. Now with scales, it's understanding a few of the basics, the most important parts. Every scale starts with what we call a root note. So whatever key, when I talk about keys, don't mean door keys, I mean musical keys. So for example, in the previous session we talked about some chords. So if you've looked at your open chord series using the G, D, E minor and C chords, the key that we were playing in, the overall key would be in G. So that means that if I'm playing a scale, playing over a chord sequence in the key of G, I need to start with a G scale, which means the first note has always got to be a G. Okay, so that's the first and foremost. So we call that the root note. So the root note is our starting note, or the key note within that scale. What we do then from that scale can either be a happy sounding scale, i.e. a major scale, or a sad sounding scale, or minor, or a little bit oriental sounding, which could what we call a harmonic minor, or it could be very bluesy, so we have a blues scale as well. So every scale has a characteristic, a stylistic approach to the sound that it makes. And that's where it becomes quite exciting, because obviously, you know, music isn't a one level thing. We have different styles, we have different genres, different musical sounds. You know, we have blues, we have rock, we have jazz, and all this kind of thing. And every scale has its place. So it's how you use these scales that kind of will shape you as a guitarist, I suppose, more than anything else. But on today's session, we're going to look at two scales. We're going to look at what they call the minor pentatonic. Now, pentatonic, for those I'm sure most of you will know, means 5. So that means we're using a 5-note scale. All right. So we'll be using a minor pentatonic scale, and then we'll be using a blues scale as well. Now, don't worry too much if that's a little bit too much information for you at the moment. All I want you to do is literally just kind of copy what I do, and you'll find once you've got a grip of the basic scales, it might not mean much today, just going through the scale, it might seem a little bit staid, but what's going to happen next is on the later session, we will use these scales and you'll start hearing some riffs and some licks that you may recognise already, and you'll be able to play them. So that's the plan. So let's get cracking. So we're going to start off with the minor scale, sorry, the minor pentatonic scale, and we're going to be using the open E string to start with. So in this session, we'll be looking at the E minor pentatonic scale and the E blues scale. Let's take a closer look. Okay, so let's start off with our E minor pentatonic scale. Now, finger-wise here, I'm really going to just be using my first and my second as a rule for this scale. So it's going to be fairly straightforward. So remember, adopting that kind of position with the hook over the top. If you wanted to go a bit higher, fine, but remember, your fingers got to go on tiptoes, so it's just how you feel comfortable with that. Right, so we're going to start by playing just the open string. Okay. Now that is actually the root note. So if we're playing in the key of E, we're starting with the E note on the low E. So that's my root note. That's our number 1. Right. Now, I mentioned pentatonic has 5 notes. So this is a 5-note scale. Right. Now, scales generally have 8 notes in, and that goes from a root note all the way through the musical scale back to that same root note again. Now, this is actually a shortened version of our 8, or what we call the octave scale. This is a 5-note, and this is actually just a really convenient way of actually getting around the guitar a little bit quicker than going through the whole scale. But you'll see what I mean by this. So let me just play it to you. So we're going to start, I'll play it first, and then I'll explain how it works and how we play it. Okay, I'll play it one more time. Okay, so I'm starting with my E, going through the scale, and then I'm actually ending back on an E note as well, but now on the D string at the 2nd fret. Now, don't worry too much about what notes you're playing here. There will be a diagram that comes up in a second on screen, which will show you just the notes on the fretboard. But you can also download that from my website as well at www.jefftop.com, and you'll also find a few other bits and pieces there as well, which will help you. So you can download that. It's good to know your notes as you become more proficient with your guitar playing. Okay, so now, what I did, and this is habit forming I'm afraid with me, I actually used my 3rd finger. When I started here, I used my 3rd finger. If you want to use your 3rd finger, fine, but if you want to use your 2nd finger, great. What I tend to say, one thing you will try and get into the habit of, obviously, you know, these fret, you want to use as many fingers as possible. You want to use all 4 fingers that you can, if you can. That takes a bit of practice, and that's something that you can work on. And learning scales is a good way of actually working with your technique on this one. But what I try and imagine is if I'm having to play certain frets, I might allocate a finger to each of those frets. Right. So if I was playing a note on the 1st fret, I'd use my first finger. Okay, second fret, second finger, third finger, and fourth finger, and so on. Right. So when I'm playing the scale, it starts with the open E. Okay, and then I'm playing the third fret like that. So I'd use my third finger. So it's up to you how you do it. But let's go through this scale anyway. So first note is the open E. Our second note of the scale is now the third fret of that of that E string. Remember, you've got your dot here as well, your marker dot, which should better help you. Then we'll go down to the open A string. So we're on the next string. Then we're going to play the second fret down to the open D string, and then to the second fret of that D string. So that gives you the scale. Okay, just play through it a couple of times. Okay, now all I'm doing just with this hand here is I'm using a pick, and I'm just picking the notes down. That's all I'm doing at the moment. And so there is a session on the pick technique and everything else, which you can find out online as well. But just what I'm doing here, you can either use your fingers as well, so it really doesn't matter how you do it, as long as it feels comfortable for you as well. All right. Okay, so that is your minor pentatonic. All right. Next scale is your blues scale, again in the key of E. So we start again with the root note of E. So this time you'll hear this scale sound slightly different, and we're just adding one more note into the mix on this one. So let me play it for you. Okay, now we basically add one extra note into this scale, and that's that note, and that's what we call the blues note of the scale. And for those that like their technical knowledge, that is what we call the flattened fifth. But I'll go no further than that at the moment. But that's technically what we class as our blues note. So the scale goes like this. We play the open E. We play the third fret of the E string, down to the open A again, then to the first fret of our A string, then to our second fret of the A, down to the D, open, and then to the second fret of that D string. Okay, and that becomes our blues scale. So we have the two scales. We have our minor pentatonic, which is just a, and then we have our our blues scale over the top of that. Okay, so those two scales are very similar. Obviously, just that one note that's different, but they are classed as two different scales. Now, you're probably thinking, well, that's fine, I can play through those scales and that's great, but what can I do with them? What's the idea? Well, let me just give you an example. We are going to look at another session, we are going to look at some basic riffs using those two scales, but if I just show you now, hopefully just to give you a bit of an idea of how we're going to go forward with this, and you'll see what I mean. So, with that selection of notes, you don't always have to play up the scale. You can play it in any order you like. As long as you hit those notes, it doesn't matter. So I could start from the bottom, or from the top, shall I say, the higher part, and play it backwards. Or I can just mix it up. Sounds very oriental in the sound, actually, but obviously how you play it is depending on how you want it to sound. If I wanted a bit more rocky with it, that's, you know, a nice little riff that we've got there, and that's just using the minor pentatonic. But if I want to use the blues, I can make it sound slightly different. So I could do a riff using the blues scale. Okay, so just a couple of little ideas there, just to have a look at for future use. I hope that helps with the scales on your E minor pentatonic and your E blues scale. Now, if you get used to the sounds of that, that's really important because your ears will play a huge part of you learning your instrument better. So try and be aware of the sounds as well, and obviously it's going to help you with your finger technique as well. Your ears are going to help you find your way around the guitar a little bit more the more you get involved and more you play. Okay, so that's it for today's session, and if you want to pop on to the next session just to have a look at how we can play some riffs, and then we'll come back at a later date. I hope that helps, and enjoy your guitar playing. Hi, welcome back to the Guitarist Guru series. On this session we're going to continue working with our E minor blues scale and E pentatonic scale that we looked at before. I'm going to extend the scale this time, i.e. add some more notes, or go into what we call the second octave of that scale. And also we're going to start looking at some riffs that you can play within those scales. So I think we'll get cracking. So first things first, let's go back to our minor pentatonic in the key of E. Last time we looked at this position. Okay, so that is our first octave of our E minor pentatonic. So what we're going to do is we're going to continue that to make 2 octaves, i.e. it just gives us some more notes to play with as well. So once I'm on my 2nd fret of my D string, that is my E. So what I'm going to do is then carry on up into the 2nd octave. So the way we do this is, I'm going to use my 2nd finger for this one, is we start on that root note again, so that now becomes the roots note. And we go down to the G, open string, 2nd fret on that G, down to the B, it's open, 3rd fret on the B, and then we finish on the high E. So all we're doing now is just continuing the scale from here like that. Now, if I put them together, i.e. the 1st octave and the 2nd octave, we're still playing a minor pentatonic. We're just playing 2 minor pentatonic scales on top of each other. So it should sound like this. Okay, so that's what you've got the 2 octaves worth there. So let's have a look at the blues scale in the key of E again. So remember before we had open, 3rd fret, open on the A, 1, 2, down to the D, open, and then again we finished on that 2nd fret of the D string, which is my E note, and that's the root note again. And so to continue that on, I start again on here, so it starts, here we go, and then down to the G, open, 2nd fret on the G, 3rd fret on the G, down to the open B string, 3rd fret again on the B, and then finishing on the high E. Okay, so this time you should get this sound. So you're now playing the blues scale in the key of E in over 2 octaves. Okay. Right, again, finger-wise, go with what you feel comfortable. You may have noticed that I'm using my 2nd and 3rd fingers there. But go again with how it works for you for the moment. But just be mindful that the more fingers you can get to use, the more fingers you can use, the more likelihood your technique's going to improve much quicker as well. And obviously, when you look further down the line, once you've mastered all of your basics here, you can take, the more fingers you use, the quicker you can play as well. Right, so, okay, we've got a couple of scales there we can use, but how do we make them sound musical? Well, let's just take a few little riff ideas. And I'm going to start introducing some little techniques into your playing here. Now, depending on what the type of the guitar that you're actually using to practice, obviously I'm using an electric guitar, which means that I can bend the strings much easier than I would be able to if I was playing a classical guitar. I'm not saying that you can't, but it's just a little bit easier because the strings are a little bit lighter to bend. All right, but you can still use these techniques and pick these up anyway, whether you can transfer them to your guitar. That's something for you to have a practice with. But we're going to go through just a few little riff ideas. They're not going to be too technical, but hopefully they're ideas that you can go, oh, they sound quite good, they sound quite musical, and I'm sure you'll recognise some of them from music that you would have heard yourself. All right. So we're just going to start off with the E minor pentatonic. We're going to start with the lower part of the scale. So we're going to be using the 1 octave first. So a little riff that I find is quite useful, as a bit of a staple riff, is when you've got your open and your 3rd fret, okay, and instead of me going down the rest of the scale, I'm just going to drop to the octave. So the open E, 3rd fret on the E string, and then down to the D string at the 2nd fret. Okay, and then I'm just going to move back to that 3rd fret on the E string, and then back to the open. So you've got this little round. Doesn't matter how you play it, you can get used to just jumping around the guitar. Now also what that does is it gets you to jump over the A string, which when you're trying to practice, it's always good to not necessarily go down on each string. It's jumping over, and what we call string skipping. And that becomes a good little technique because it gets your right hand used to playing. If you just see what I'm doing here, you get your right hand very used to kind of just jumping over strings a little bit more. Okay, so it's good little practice really, and do it without actually looking at the strings when you do it. It's always quite a good practice idea as well. So I've got. Okay, now the other thing I'm just adding in here is what we call a blues curl, and it's just a little bend. It's just a little tiny little bend. So if I go to my 3rd fret here, what I'm doing is just pulling it down, so it takes the pitch away from its normal position. That's what we call blues curl. You don't have to do that, but it just adds a little bit more dynamic to that riff as well. So, okay, so that's one little riff you've got there. We're just going to take that minor pentatonic, but now into the 2nd octave, and all I'm going to do is I'm going to go backwards, or go back down the scale. So I'm going to start now with a high E, the high E string, open. That in itself, I'm literally just walking back up the scale. Okay, and just getting used to really kind of just working backwards as well. So from there, I might go. All I'm doing is just walking between those 2 notes there. Okay, and just making some sounds that aren't necessarily scalic to the point that we're going up and down the scale all the time. I'm varying what the notes in between. So this little area here. Again, still sounds a little bit Chinese, but if you can play it against something, i.e. a backing track, which you can go on YouTube and you can have a look. If you type in E minor guitar backing track, you'll be inundated with loads of backing tracks. All you need to do is just stick it on in the background, just play around with these scales, and what you'll find is that these notes will fit nicely over that backing track. And that'll be something we'll demonstrate a little bit later on. But this is really just to get a little bit of freedom within those scales that you're playing. Alright, now I'm going to be a bit sneaky to a point. I'm actually going to break out a little bit from this scale here at the bottom, just to show you a kind of a riff that you may well recognise using the minor pentatonic here. So I'm now going to start on the 3rd fret of the high E string. Now actually, it's exactly the same note as the 3rd fret on this low E string. So yes, it's still part of that scale, but what this is now going past our 2nd octave of that scale. Don't worry if that kind of goes over your head at the moment, don't worry about that, but all you need to bear in mind is that note there is also part of the same scale. It's just going a little bit higher, and we're starting to get a bit higher at the guitar. So if I play, you may recognise that riff from a 60s track, I believe, Shaking All Over. It's the original song. Now, what I'm doing here is I'm actually adding another little technique here. So what I'm doing, I'm picking that note here, and I'm just taking my finger off. I'm not actually re-picking that string, so I'm not going, I'm actually just literally going, just pulling that note. Now that note there, that's what we do there is what we call pulling off the note. Okay? And if you do it to the string above, do the same thing, and then that note, so, okay, so that's what you call pulling off of notes. Now the reverse of that is what we call hammering on. Now hammering on is where you literally your finger becomes a hammer, so you're not picking it, you're hammering it. And what I mean by that is, again, when you get to this part of the riff, so I'm hammering that note on, so I'm being quite forceful with it, a bit like a trigger finger. Now, by having these little techniques, what you'll find is you're starting to add a bit more dynamic to your riff playing as well. You remember, you're still only ever playing the scales here, so you're not doing anything too technical, but you can make these scales sound really good with some of these basic riffs. Right? So you've got a couple of little riffs there with your minor pentatonic. There are loads, and the more you play, the more you'll just automatically pick some of these up as well. So let's have a look at the blues side of things. So we've obviously got our blues scale. Okay, so let's start adding some of the blues notes in. So again, you've got your little blues curl that I mentioned before. Okay, we could add our blues note if we did something like this. So we could start off. So all I'm doing is just literally walking. So it's nice little blues riff. Start and back to the open E. Okay, so that's a couple of little ideas there, just by using that blues note in there. So that's the lower octave. What about the higher one? So let's just try this one. Now there's no rules necessarily to this. You don't have to start every riff with the root note, i.e. the E in this one. You can start anywhere in the scale, and the way I look at it is that when you're practicing anything like this, if you can end a little riff back on a root note, so always focus back onto that root note, that kind of gives you a bit more grounding, that gives you an understanding of the scale. You understand the scale if you can get back to that root. but it doesn't mean to say you have to start on that note, on the root note. So for this riff, I'm going to have a blues section. I'm going to start here on the 2nd fret of the G. So it's going to go. That's very bluesy in the sense it sounds nice when you do it nice and slow. So all I'm doing here is this 2nd fret on the G, 3rd fret, which is the blues note, open B, back to the 3rd fret on the G, back to the 2nd fret on the G, open on the G, and then what you're doing is you're heading back to that root note, which is the E there. So okay, if you wanted to, you can add a bit more to that. You can go back to the lower part of that scale and maybe use the open E here, and then play that little blues curl back to that root note. So you put them all together. Okay. And that in itself, you're combining actually the pentatonic scale and the blues scale together. They do blur, so they do cross over each other quite a lot. So and then from there you can walk on up the scale. So all you're doing is piecing little bits of riff together, and from just the basic scales here, suddenly you can take it off into lots of different areas as well. But it does take practice, and what I would recommend is just using those scales together, combine them, put them all in together. As long as you've got all those notes in that area that you're playing, you'll find that you'll end up coming up with riffs yourself. And try and push your playing as much as you possibly can, but also try and get used to using more than one finger. If you're using more than one finger, it becomes actually a little bit harder. You know, you've got 4 fingers in your hand, so I don't expect you necessarily to use your little finger yet, or your third to a degree. But if you can get 1 or 2, those riffs fit quite nicely. All right. And then if you want to add a little bit more into it, just to kind of really spice it up, you can add what you had before with that little riff. So you can put all the riffs together really. So you've got okay, so I'm literally just kind of making it up as I go along a little bit on that one. But if it gives you an idea, that is a basic form of improvising. So, and that is improvising itself is a skill to pick up and learn. Hope that works for you. I hope you can enjoy that, and I hope you can get your fingers around some of those little riffs. So you've got, just to just quickly recap, you've got little blues, pulling the string down. All you're doing there is just literally just pulling the string down, just giving it a bit of a wobble. Be a bit confident on it, then you'll get a good sound out of that. So you've got a little blues curl, and then you've got your hammering on, you're pulling off, but you've also got a hammer on as well, so it's hammering the note onto the string. So instead of re-picking when you get to the 2nd fret there, you're actually hammering that note to make that sound. So hammering on, pulling off, hammering. Okay, good stuff. Hope you enjoyed, and I'll catch you on the next